Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Conference. My name is Samuel Coates, and I'm going to briefly introduce you to today's discussion about local communities. This is the seventh and final event organised by the CSJ during this year's virtual Tory conference. I don't want to invoke the seventh and most deadly sin in front of a bishop, but I'm very proud that we are finishing with such a strong panel, and on a topic I think we're all thinking about more than ever before. Over the last 3 days, there have been some really interesting debates, lots of new ideas, and actually even larger audiences than we would normally get in a sweaty room in a Hotel Hyatt. And this event is no exception to that. So shout out to Serena, the events manager, and the whole team for pulling it all together. So we're joined this afternoon by four very thoughtful leaders who will come at this issue from different perspectives and backgrounds. Just briefly on my own background and role here, I've worked as a special advisor in a few government departments, both here and abroad. And in the coming months, I'll be leading a new CSJ project, looking at how to take this agenda of sort of communityism, for want of a better word, and how to take that forward. We'll be launching that project properly in a few weeks, so you're the first to hear about that. But essentially, we'll be sketching out a sort of a framework for policy that supports that in a local community level of identity, responsibility, and decision making. And that'll be from a government perspective, both central and local, but also local businesses, institutions, and individuals. So I think this is a very timely topic, socially and politically, and something that's core to the CSJ philosophy, with its alliance of several hundred community-sized organisations. And we're very, very grateful as well to the NatWest Group, who will be supporting this work, not just with resources, but with their own brain power and a real desire to be the change on this issue. I also know there's many people tuning in now. We've got a really great audience. With lots of experience in different aspects. So please do shoot an email to the CSJ and we'd love to chat about it more. As with most things, COVID has provided some real opportunities and challenges to this agenda, to local communities. So we're going to kick off today first hearing from Danny Kruger, MP. Danny's kindly agreed to share with us the underlying thinking behind this new report for the Prime Minister about how to build on that amazing community spirit we saw during lockdown. Then we'll hear from Graham Tomlin, the Bishop of Kensington and President of St. Mellitus College. Graham will offer his thoughts on why all this matters from both a moral and practical perspective and how we can strengthen communities. Then we've got Stephen Blackman, who is Principal Economist and Head of Strategic Research for the NatWest Group. Stephen very much brings that brain power I mentioned and will speak to the trends he's seeing being driven by COVID and the potential opportunities in those. And finally, I'm very grateful to be joined by Baroness Diana Barron, the Minister for Civil Society in DCMS, and someone with a lot of personal experience in the charity sector as well. Diana will offer her thoughts on what we've heard from a government perspective and how she sees things moving forward. So there's lots of interesting ground to cover here. Most important part of this event, though, is that you, the audience, have an opportunity to pose your questions to the panel. So I am going to limit these introductions to just a few minutes each. While you're listening to our speakers, just pop your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll pull out as many questions as I can as we get into the second half. Okay, that's enough from me. And Danny, over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and very grateful for this platform. So I'll just quickly explain what I've written and why. I spent, just a background quickly on me, before as an MP, spent 12 years running local charities in London and had a bit to do with government policy around civil society. And I think I'm a classic victim of what I came to think of as corona confirmation bias, by which the pandemic confirmed for us all exactly what we thought already and made us think it even more so. So my diagnosis of what has gone right and wrong during the pandemic is a sort of intensification of what I think was right and wrong about our social and economic model before, which will be no surprise, and I think a lot of people feel that. However, I'm sure I'm right, and I will try and convey that in the next couple of minutes. So the inspiration for my report, which is called Levelling Up Communities, Proposals for a New Social Covenant, was my experience as a local MP seeing what people in Wiltshire did in response to the shutdown, the lockdown, which was the most amazing, spontaneous uprising of community spirit and neighbourliness, and these amazing mutual aid groups thousands of them forming all over the country. And civil society, existing civil society working incredibly well, also really positive flexibility shown by the public sector, and a new spirit of social responsibility in business as well. So we saw, I think, the outlines of what our society could look like if we got our public policy right and our culture right. So that's what I wanted to try and convey in the report. I open it with a bit of a critique of the economic and social doctrine that we've all been living under over the last 40 years, which is the idea of economic mobility on one hand, which is the notion that capital and labour will find each other naturally through the frictionless process, and so as towns deindustrialised, capital would flow in to take advantage of cheap land and labour, and that labour, unemployed people, would flow out to find jobs in the big city. And neither of those really happened. And the same places that were suffering 40 years ago are suffering today. And it's because capital needs more than just cheap land and labour to attach to a place. It needs a livable, attractive place with the right infrastructure and investable propositions. And likewise, labour isn't just going to flow to where there's economic opportunity. Places are sticky and people are attached to their towns. And I think these are good facts and ones that we should endorse and respond to by making places more attractive to capital, and by honouring the attachment that people have to their towns. So that's in a sense of basis of my thinking, and also inspired by and had as a sort of cautionary tale the experience of the big society of 10 years ago or so, which was, I think, absolutely the right idea, possibly for the wrong moment. Although it's never really the wrong moment for these ideas, but it had a very tricky time for lots of reasons. And perhaps it wasn't sufficiently ambitious. And I think we should have a very ambitious version of the big society now, which is much more transformational. So the report focuses on, sets out policy proposals or recommendations, very much high level. I'm not, the whole idea is that these ideas need to be worked on with people and with communities and with all the people who got involved in the pandemic and civil society. I don't propose, even if Diana agreed with everything I've suggested, that she just tries to implement every recommendation. That's the wrong way of making policy in this space, in my view. So high-level ideas, group them around the headings of power, people, and place. I think we need a big transfer of power to communities, and there's some recommendations for how to do that. I believe in parishes and in local government, and also in the right of civil society organisations to take responsibility for the delivery of public services and the management of local assets. So we need to let communities take back control of the power structures in their places. People, we need a much more, we need more infrastructure for volunteering. We need to enable volunteering and support it and back it. And there's lots of ways we can discuss around that. I also think we need a new deal for faith communities so that they can play their role, play a more central role in public services and in local life, rather than being sort of knocking on the windows they so often seem to have to. And then finally, on place, planning rules to protect or create new gathering places. I think the great tragedy of this lockdown, it's created the spontaneous spirit of volunteering, but it's closed the places that people gather in. Churches being the obvious example. I'm very interested in Bishop Graham's view on that, because I think it's a great tragedy that we haven't been able to gather. And as we come out of this awful time, we need to be focusing on creating the places for gathering. And then other stuff around protecting local assets, and I believe in the library and the youth club and the sports centre, and how we can support these. And then finally, let's use the great marvellous lump of free money that's coming from the dormant assets account, dormant assets to, I know Diana's keen on this idea, to use money for investment in social infrastructure. That's enough from me. Back to you, Sam.
Thanks, Danny. That's really helpful and a very timely report as well. It's good to see the Prime Minister respond to that at this so soon in the wake of lockdown, hopefully the first and only lockdown. And yes, a lot to build on there with that report. I'll now hand over to Bishop Graham.
Thank you, Sam. And hello, everybody out there. And I can't see you all, but I'm presuming you can see me. But thank you also, Danny, for your report, which I found really interesting reading to get a sense of where the direction of your thought was going. I want to speak a little bit about this idea of local community, why it matters, and how we might build it. And just to share I guess some ideas from particular thinkers who've influenced me in thinking about this. I guess the first one is that very strange French philosopher Simone Weil, who died at a very young age, but had an extraordinary impact, maybe sort of more after her life than her own. But she wrote a book which some of you may know. It's a little book called The Need for Roots. And she says in this that to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. And I think there's something very profound about that. The idea that we as human beings, we need to be rooted in a place and in a community. That if we're disembedded from place and disembedded from other people, something goes wrong with us as human beings. And I think she's onto something there. So that sense of being rooted in place and community is something quite essential to us. And as a Christian, that seems to be rooted in the whole idea of incarnation, the idea that God himself put down roots in a place and a community at a particular time and place. So I think that's where I go first, is why this thing matters, because of this deep human need for roots, for rootedness, for a sense of being grounded and founded in places and in communities. And the building of stable communities, the dealing with loneliness and isolation, that recognition that loneliness and isolation are really bad for us. And there's lots of evidence out there that community does all kinds of things for health and well-being in all kinds of ways as well. But I want to say a little bit also about how we build community and what matters for us, because it seems to me there are a number of sort of broad trends around in our philosophical, economic, social thinking about ourselves, neither of which I think build community. One is, if you like, the kind of libertarian individualism that says that we are essentially autonomous individuals who desire to be free from the demands of others, free to do what we want as long as we don't harm anyone else. That sort of J.S. Mill kind of approach to life. And it seems to me that, we could go into this in great detail, but it seems to me the flaw at the heart of that is that if freedom is simply freedom to do as I choose, as long as I don't harm anybody else, what does that do to my relationship with everybody else? What it does is it sets them up as a threat or a limitation to my freedom. It doesn't establish bonds between us. And we need an understanding of freedom that does establish bonds between us. And that one I don't think does. The other broad trend, I think, in our society is, if you like, if the first one is that libertarian individualism, a kind of love for the self, if you like, a focus upon our own selves. The second one is tribalism, that love for those who are like us. That sense that, the people who are the objects of my love are my family, my friends, my tribe, my nation, and so on. Again, that, it seems to me, will go a certain degree towards building community, but there will always be people who are left out of that sense. That if my object of my love is and my regard is those who are simply like me, what about those who are not like me? What are those who don't fit into the various networks of relationship within our society? So what will build community, and I think this is the one main thing I want to say in my 5 minutes, is that we need to rediscover the idea of the neighbor. The idea of love for neighbor, which is a core idea, and actually a much more radical idea, I think, in the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition than we often think. It sort of trips off the tongue, love your neighbor. We got that idea. We don't know what it is, but it's a very radical idea. The idea that the primary object of my love in civil society is not actually my friends, my tribe, my family. Actually, it's my neighbor. And of course, the neighbor is the person you don't choose. You don't choose who lives in the house next door to you, or who works at the desk next door to you, or who you meet at the bus stop every morning, or who serves you in the shop. You don't choose that person. They may be very different from you, but that's the person, according to this Judeo-Christian idea, that is the primary object of our love in civil society. That doesn't go against our love for our families and our friends. Yes, we have a particular focus upon them. We have a need to provide for them, but this demand to love goes beyond that to the neighbor. And I guess the thinker who particularly focuses upon this is Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, in his little book, Works of Love, which is one of the most penetrating books on the nature of love. And basically he argues in this book that actually love for neighbor is the highest form of love. It's actually higher than romantic love or erotic love or preferential love, as he calls it. And he makes this opposition between preferential love and love for neighbor. Preferential love is love for the people that we like, or maybe the person that we're falling in love with or whatever. And he says the problem with that kind of love is number one, it's exclusive. If it's just love for the people I like or people I have fallen in love with or whatever it might be, what happens to the ex-offender? What happens to the migrant? What happens to the person who is not loved by anyone else? It's an exclusive form of love. Neighbor love is absolutely everybody's involved in it. You can imagine this idea taking root in our society that everybody sensed they had an obligation to love their neighbor. Nobody would be left out because everybody has a neighbor of some kind or another. The other critique Kierkegaard makes about it is that preferential love is fleeting. It depends on our feeling, our digestion, the weather, all those kind of things. Whereas love for neighbor is basically an obligation. And I think it's that idea of love for neighbor as a basic obligation that my neighbor is someone to whom I'm obliged to offer love. And when it says, love your neighbor as yourself, it simply means that the things I make sure I have myself, enough food, enough shelter, that I have education, that I have friends, that I have the things I enjoy in life, those things that I do for myself, I also make sure I do for my neighbor as well. I make sure it's important that I make sure my neighbor has those things as I do too. So I guess the core idea I want to share and maybe get us to think about a little bit is to recapture the idea of the neighbor as the primary object of love in civic society, the person who happens to be next to you. And if that idea took root, that love for neighbor is not just a kind of preference, not just a sort of optional extra, but actually it's an obligation. Every single person has an obligation to love their neighbor, what difference that would make to our social life and our communities.
Thank you very much for those reflections. 3/4 of people say it's really important to know your neighbours, but 3/4 of people in the UK don't know their neighbours. So that's a really important concept. Just a reminder to the audience, thank you for all the questions coming in. If you just type into the Q&A box at the bottom, I'll then pull them out after the introductions. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody. It was really interesting, Graham, what you were saying there in terms of loving your neighbour, because I think a lot of people confuse love and like or think they're synonymous, but actually, we don't necessarily have to agree with somebody, share their views, share the way that they perceive their identity, or even to like them very much, but you can still, in a sense, want to be part of a community with them, to love them in that sense. It's a different thing. And I'm going to start with something slightly kind of different today. I'm going to start with a question, which is, what is a good, inverted commas, community? And I'd like, particularly our audience, just to kind of close your eyes just for a few seconds. Time's precious, we've only got 5 minutes, but just close your eyes. I'm going to try it for a few seconds and just try and imagine, picture a good community. Okay, just as long as that. Yeah. Now, I don't think anyone's really pictured a fully sketched out painting here, but for me, what came to mind was a space, a physical space, something in the real world, and people, and actually different people. And I'd wager actually that for most people, what was quite interesting is when you closed your eyes, you didn't actually envisage an economic world. You didn't envisage a transaction of any description. And in fact, I'd wager even more that probably if I'd asked you to picture a kind of a bad community, you were more likely to kind of picture a transaction kind of taking place. And the point being, in a strange way, is that it's not that economics doesn't matter. I'm an economist by training. It does matter. And I will argue that it matters. It's just that what we've learned from Danny's report and what we've heard from both Graham and Danny today is it's a complex issue interwoven with issues of identity, community, social attitudes, infrastructure. That's both physical infrastructure and social infrastructure as well. And I heed, the words of, again, the excellent writings of fellow panelists, in recent reports, saying that we do need to approach the concept of communities with, a good dollop of humility. Because I think the policies in the past have tended to focus quite narrowly on economics, and actually economics in the wrong place when looking at economics. It's been about, well, we need to focus on jobs. Yes, jobs are important, but where are those jobs? Does every community need 20 machine learning specialists, or at least the jobs for 20 machine learning specialists? No, but we would like to make communities that are attractive for people of all types of careers to want to go and kind of live in. And I think that, in a sense, COVID has amplified, and to use the phrase of the day, intensified the ability to do that. You know, it's separated the digital acceleration, I'll get onto that, that COVID has enabled or facilitated, actually enables us to reframe what matters from a community and an economic perspective. You know, COVID has been a bucket of cold water over norms, you know, and you sometimes need that. And you actually come through and you see it in terms of the phrase build back kind of better. We saw it with the Prime Minister's statement yesterday. You're seeing it with political, academic, business, ecclesiastical and wider religious kind of leaders across the world, looking at COVID as an opportunity to think about the structures, the way that we structured society, and the way in which some of those structures weren't working for everyone, weren't enabling everyone to participate. And by participation, we're talking about participation within and kind of a network as as well. So in a sense, communities by definition are a social construct. They are overlaid aspects of the decisions that we've made historically and contemporaneously, and our biases, our judgments, our rules, our decisions. Now that makes it incredibly complex, but it actually offers a hope from a policy perspective as well, because there are many avenues that we can make small and hopefully positive contributions. And the second thing that I think that we can agree on is that COVID has been a great accelerant. Yes, an accelerant in terms of many trends, but also an accelerant in us wanting to understand the complexities of the society that we have. And we've come a long way in the last few years in particular with this understanding of what makes a good, in inverted commas, community. And that it is, you know, an interconnection of attitudes, infrastructure, you know, the fabric of that community. And economics is just one of those threads that entwines or is interwoven within a kind of a greater tapestry. I think it's important, what we learn from that is, yes, people make places as a truism, but places also make people. We are, in a sense, a product of where we are. We are not separate from it. And I think this kind of alludes to what Graham was saying about atomization or individualization. So I think working from home provides us an opportunity to repurpose the relationship that we have with our community. So we know from official data, 80% of us are using our local parks now. And I think that COVID also intensifies the need and accelerated that need for us to think about what is a tool that's good for the digital world and what benefits does the physical world actually give to us, those local parks, those interactions, those physical kind of spaces. And I think it's an opportunity for cities as well. You know, we were asking people, particularly those who make cities function, who serve the coffees, who clean our offices, to make kind of difficult choices to undergo ever more onerous journeys or to live in ever more cramped accommodation. And if you think about it, people were buying property that was ever more expensive to leave vacant for most of the time, to go to somewhere else in a car probably that they would also leave vacant for most of the time. It's just an incredible waste of assets. And again, so COVID, an opportunity to bring back both the production side of the economy, the jobs, albeit that's probably headquartered remotely within the local community as well. That point I'm trying to make about you don't need to have the jobs for 20 machine learnists, but you can have a place where it makes them attractive for them to want to kind of come and live and actually be much less wasteful in the process. That when you look at things on a local level, there are production places and there are consumption. Everyone does it all, every place does it all, but some have kind of specialism. What COVID does is kind of blend that, blur that more and more. And we would tend to focus more commercially and attitudinally, particularly for men, in what happens on their local area. Because no place was a good community. If you took a place that was a, you know, on paper, a good community, actually, they had some of the greatest differences in gender pay across the country because of the way that people wanted to structure their lives. So in a sense, this is an opportunity for families to work kind of to build a more of a kind of local focus in what they do. And I started by asking what makes a good community. And I think that it is that intermarriage of the social, the community, the fabric, the kind of the infrastructure, as well as the opportunity to kind of to create, to kind of forge the career that you want to have. I think that COVID offers us a unique opportunity to kind of make that happen. And that's why it's exciting now to kind of be involved in a process that I am. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I really like the language you're using though of overlaid, interwoven, interconnected. It really shows that this is a sort of, we've had divided times in recent years of Brexit, BLM, this community is something, it's this superordinate in the goal, it's this layer of identity which isn't about homogenous silos of different communities, it's everyone, as the Bishop said, coming together despite maybe having different views or despite not having a sort of direct personal interest in it. And so that's really helpful. And I'll now finally just like to pass on to the Minister, Baroness Barron, for her reflections from government.
Thanks, Sam, very much indeed. I'm feeling like I ought to offer up my 5 minutes because I think the 3 previous speakers were so fascinating. They all deserve a minute and a half more. But if that's not an option, I will share my ideas and thoughts. So I guess the first thing I wanted to say, which I suppose I feel is often not recognised, is that as a government we do think that civil society organisations and all the fabric that helps make up communities, and Danny was very modest when he said he was a bit involved in civil society. I inherited a fantastic strategy courtesy of him. So and obviously that was most visible through the funding that we supplied. The first sector-specific package that we did as a government was the £750 million of funding for the voluntary sector. And the reason we did that was because we felt that particularly small local community-based organisations had the knowledge of their local communities about where help would be needed, and critically had the trust of those communities in offering support. And I think we're, simply put, delighted to have been able to be in a position to provide that help. I think in some ways the pandemic has been a kind of bonding thing. Some communities have really come together and we've seen really remarkable mobilization. But I also think in some ways the experience has been starkly different. For those with a garden and good relationships in their family, many have found time. I had my husband and I had our 4 grown-up children home. That's something pretty special as parents. But if we hadn't had room for that, and we'd all been in very cramped accommodation and no outside space and very difficult relationships, that would be a whole other story. So I think we need to recognize that for some communities this has been incredibly frightening, both economically and health-wise frightening. But I think all of us have at some point felt some vulnerability over this time, and maybe that brings us more together. Just in terms of how we go forward, and I think that when I was reading Danny's report, one of the things that it sort of highlighted for me was that in a way, Corona took away that sense of power, the sense of connection, and the sense of being able to be part of a solution. And I think many of us who feel that maybe we've come through this better have found through volunteering, through being part of our community, that actually it has given us back a sense of control. It has helped build connections, and it has helped us recognize the value of, you know, service without wanting to sound pompous at all. I probably do, but I hope not too much. Actually, everybody, you know, one speaks to who's helped or volunteered feels they've got more from it than they gave, and I'm sure many on this call will recognize that. So turning to the role of government going forward, I think there's 2 or 3 things that we should do. I think there's 2 things we should do, and then there's one about the how we do it. In terms of what we do, I think our role is to help unlock resources for the sector. And by resources, I mean time, which will focus predominantly on volunteering, skills, where I think there's more work to be done in terms of digital, but also data. And then finally, obviously, money. And, you know, we were pleased recently, we did a pilot of matching some of our funding with philanthropists and foundations. We were really delighted about how well that worked and the areas of the country that we're able to reach through that. We'd like to do more of that, but also at many different levels and different types of capital, whether it be government contracts, whether it be social impact bonds. There's dormant assets that Danny referred to. Secondly, I think we have a responsibility to try and measure stuff better. So Stephen talked about the fact it's not all about economics. It definitely isn't. But actually, you know, there's a lot of money that is supporting civil society organizations. And I think we all have a responsibility to try and understand how to use that to best effect. And then the last bit on the how comes back, I think, to what the Bishop was saying about neighbours and relationships. I think we need to try and do it in a way where we're listening, and Danny set a fantastic challenge in his report about a national conversation. We need to do it in a way that shows that we listen and then trust people to get on and deliver. And I can't match the Simone Weil quote, but just to sort of close with what I think is also behind that, there's a lovely quote that some of you will know from the poet Rumi, who says, "Beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I will meet you there." And I think that was a bit behind some of the sentiments we heard about not choosing your neighbour, but actually that ability to set aside our differences and find out what we have in common being so crucial to our communities going forward. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. So we'll move to the Q&A now. Just in the interest of trying to answer as many of the questions as possible, I'll just go straight to a panelist with each one. If you have very strong views, do jump in as well, but I'll just try and get through them. So I'll try and keep it quite short and sharp. And Darren, actually, if I just come straight back to you, if I can. You talked about, I mean, it's been a very disempowering moment, you know, COVID. You know, we've all felt that. And as you say, some people have found empowerment through the local action. I certainly relate to that, and you know, finding meaning and usefulness by helping your community. We've got a few questions along the lines of local government, and I know you're more DCMS than MHCLG, but I just wonder, from your perspective, to what extent does this moment and this emphasis on localism also require more devolution and you know, stronger local government? We've got a question from Celine Shafi, who highlights that local councils have a big part to play, but some of them are close to declaring bankruptcy. We've also got a question about parish councils as well. So I just wondered, I know there's talk of a government Devo paper at some point. Is there anything on that which you could speak to?
Well, I guess there's sort of 2 or 3 things. you know, one is clearly the financial strains on some local authorities are enormous, and it's hard, as all of us have lived through in the last 6 months. It's really hard. You know, this is, I don't know what the COVID equivalent of flying a plane and building it at the same time, but, you know, trying to implement a big change program like devolution at a time when you're under tremendous stress is clearly incredibly challenging. What I think I would say is that we have certainly seen some smaller examples of devolution of power in terms of citizens' assemblies, participatory grant making, so really giving local residents the information and the power to make some changes in their communities, but it's unquestionably challenging. So we need to focus, I think, on the art of the possible while not losing the big prize in terms of devolving more power.
Okay, thank you. Bishop Graham, I'll just turn to you. We've got a couple of similar questions here. There's one from Jeanette Hughes, who asks, how do we encourage a sense of community where that community already has no hope? And I think we're particularly talking about a lot of local communities here, which, you know, a lot of people feel like their best days are behind them. And similarly, Carrie Deacon asks, she says that she loves the concept of starting with love my neighbour, and just asks what will be the starting actions you would advocate for that spirit to spread and to take hold. Obviously, in some communities, this is already powerful, but some people and places aren't experiencing this. So what conditions do we need to focus on to help this take hold too?
Thanks, Sam. I think, just a quick answer to the hope question. It's a really significant one because there are many communities that have lost hope, and I guess the one that I know best in that is the North Kensington one. I was obviously very involved in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire because that happened in one of the parishes where I was involved. And I think that what struck me about that was that the thing that builds hope is trust, or the thing that erodes hope is mistrust. And it was an area where actually there was a lot of mistrust of government, local and national. And so somehow, you know, when you build trust, that builds hope. And I think what builds trust, I think it's one is ongoing relationship. It's commitment over a period of time. You know, it takes time for people who don't trust others to actually learn to trust them. And so it's that steady long-term commitment to a particular place. I want to talk about that in a moment. I mean, it relates back to this idea about need for roots. But it's all about keeping promises. Trust is built when people feel that promises are made and kept. Trust is eroded when promises are made and not kept. So I think those are two key things in terms of the building of hope, where hope is not present. It's just that ability to stick at it. It's in some ways rather boring and ordinary. It's just sticking at a relationship for a long period of time, but building trust through keeping promises and being faithful in that sense. And, which leads us on, I guess, to the second question, which is about what are the steps we can take towards this idea of loving neighbour. What would we need for that? I think a number of things come to mind. I mean, one is, I think, a narrative that tells us why our neighbour matters. We somehow need a narrative that says that, you know, my neighbour does matter and is the object of my proper love, and I have an obligation to my neighbour. Obviously, as a Christian, for me, that narrative is that person is made in the image of God as much as I am or anybody else is. Other religions will have their own sort of versions of that, or there may be secular analogues as well. But somehow we need a narrative that tells us why our neighbour matters and why we have an obligation to our neighbour, and it's not just an optional extra. I think it needs that. I think it needs stability. We need stable communities. I think one of the things I noticed about North Kensington again was that the lack of stability, which relates to housing as well. If we've got a housing market which is effectively unstable, where people can't put down roots, they can't stay for a long period of time because actually the rents are always rising, or it's fluctuating, or it's a very unstable place, people feel committed. They invest in the community if they feel they're going to stay for a long time. If they feel they're actually going to be there for 6 months, they don't really invest in it. So I think stability is a crucial part of it. I think opportunities, some of this relates back to what Stephen was saying about what if local businesses actually made it possible for people to spend an afternoon or a day a week actually volunteering in their local community, giving to that local community, having those opportunities to do it. And I like Danny's emphasis upon volunteering. And I think that the last thing I'd say is just simply, it's a simple action starting with you, with me, walking across the road to not just remain isolated in our little bubbles, in our sort of individualistic view of the world, but making that connection with the neighbor, whoever that neighbor is, making that connection, taking an interest in their lives, finding out what matters to them. That's the beginning. That can spark off something. And we've seen that a bit during COVID times with the sort of WhatsApp groups emerging, everyone coming out for claps for carers, seeing each other in a way that they haven't done before. So it's like those individual little actions of making the connection with the neighbor that begins to spark a change.
Yeah, just on that last point, and Stephen referenced technology as well. It's extraordinary that the internet has connected us to everyone in the world, almost apart from people who live near us. And street-based WhatsApp groups are such a relatively low-tech thing now. But it took a moment like this to sort of generate that. And also, just on that point, we've got a question from Tracy Robbins, which just speaks to what you're saying about getting out there. It's just a useful point I just put out there, that we need to ensure that people are given the permission to meet and be on their own streets and in gathering places as much as possible, just to maintain that sense of belonging. So that's one of the many balancing acts the government has to do when it's devising its COVID rules. Danny, if I just might turn to you. I mean, we were both, you mentioned Big Society, and we were both, it feels like half a century ago, involved in sort of the Cameron opposition years in sort of articulating that. We've had a couple of questions about that as well. Kieran Breen says, levelling up communities is a good paper. But historically, we've had talk of big societies, third ways, communitarianism. How do we make the levelling up agenda stick? How do we get business, community, and government to work together? Now, I know you'll have been thinking about that with the report.
Yeah. I mean, that's the right question, and I mean, I'm not disheartened by the fact that this idea has been around before. I mean, it's the ancient idea. It predates even David Cameron. It is the oldest idea around. In my view, it's the notion of a political society is one where people work on their on the management of their common spaces, and we need to harness all these different players. And the question around how to get government, civil society, and business working together is the right one. I mean, not to forget, Theresa May had a similar idea. Didn't get off the ground really, but she talked about the shared society and about the role of those different players and how everybody has their respective responsibility. I think one of the problems with the big society, at least in the way it came across, if not intentionally, was it felt like this is just about voluntarism and what charities can do. Actually, the vision we have here is one in which everything is done better. But I think the timing is more propitious because we are. I mean, although we have an even greater fiscal crisis impending than they did in 2010, it doesn't look like we propose doing anything about that immediately. So we are. There's a lot of spending in the system, and we're able to spend and to use the budgets that have been released, I think, really positively to harness the agenda. I mean, one small tactical opportunity is the Kickstart program that's been announced. I think that should be explicitly adapted to allow young people to be employed in social and environmental projects to avoid the disaster of long-term unemployment for them. It doesn't all have to be about commercial jobs in the private sector. But I would just echo a point that Stephen made. I mean, the fundamental issue is how to create a more local economy and how to, as he put it, blur our roles as consumers and producers in a place. If a risk of nostalgic, evocation of this of a pre-industrial age when we all operated cottage industries within sight of our cottage. Or even within it, the loom and the field and the cow. There is something good about the idea of a local economy and one that is rooted, as Bishop Graham was saying, and adapting the world of work in that way. And I completely agree. The moment we have the smallest houses and the longest commutes in Europe, our whole way of living is geared around working far from home and coming home to sleep in a rabbit hutch, and that's what's wrong. So if we can have a more local economy, I think we liberate the sort of social resources to create good neighbourhoods.
I think that's a good point to come back to you on, Stephen, in terms of the trends you're seeing in COVID. I think probably the biggest one which might have an impact on local communities is that the remote working, the fact that we're all here today speaking from different places, the increase in local shopping, and people can potentially work for more sort of smaller local communities without having to live in sort of zone 1 urban centres. I mean, do you think these trends will largely stick, and will that potentially help to bring maybe a renaissance in high streets as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, it's a fool's errand to try and predict, particularly in terms of the future of cities, what's going to happen. But when you have both the desire, i.e. people have found time that they didn't have before, or some people, those who have benefited from not having to commute, have found time before, which could be used in productive ways personally or for the wider community. So when, and that, and when you also have employers that are going to have to look at ways in which they can balance the needs of their employees, the welfare of their employees, with a more rigorous focus on costs, then that probably, when you have both sides coming together, that probably does mean that the way that we structure our offices and how we use them will change. I'm reasonably, there's a lot of talk about whether it's called the kind of, the hipsters and geeks, the kind of drive of the last decade has been driven by that symbiosis, to use a fancy word, of, the kind of tech industry with the creative industries driving a lot of the technological knowledge-based economy. And that's been primarily in city centers. And that without that, it might slow economic growth. I don't know, if you look at the 300 years of, innovation is often spurred by existential crises. And I think it breaks down vested interests. And there's a lot of very smart people now that are focusing on ways in which we can make this work better. Because you're right, just as with communities, it doesn't work when it's too strong, when it's too about tribal, when it's too about family, and it doesn't work when it's too individualistic. It works when you have the chance encounter. It works when you, in a sense, what's called the weak ties, when different groups within communities can come together. And they may be different, but familiarity doesn't actually breed contempt. It actually breeds trust to a certain extent, or it does remove fear, I think. So I think you can then begin to kind of build a social cohesion that way. I think there will be a need for office space, but I think it will be we'll go to work often to talk about work. It will be a social interaction. And I think there will probably be a blended model. So I think that does leave for those, and often we can see clear relationship between the suitability to home working and pay. Yeah. So essentially, there will be a greater focus and a greater commercialization on the local. I know I've been speaking for a while, but I think if you blend all those things together that I've been talking about, I think you can begin to kind of unpick and build on that foundation as a way in which, from a micro level, i.e. not from top down, we're going to be doing X, Y, and Z. I think that's important, but I think real change will actually come from making small changes to the physical space that enables the chance encounter, that encourages familiarization, that then means that there's less mistrust, that can help with the commercialization, that would help. Do you see what I mean? It's a kind of bottom-up process as much as a top-down one.
Thank you. And Diana, if I just come back to you, there's, I mean, you're in a, speaking of top-down, you as a minister, you have access to some top-down levers, and the government has a role to play in stimulating some of these sort of ground up kind of initiatives. We've got quite a few questions in the realm of the various kind of community development funds. So a couple of people asking specifically about Danny's recommendation about creating a national endowment for communities from dormant assets. Reverend Carol Smith is asking about asset-based community development as a way of recognising assets that our neighbours treasure. And Louisa Mitchell is also asking about how do you think commissioning and contracting relationships between government and civil society organisations could change to help this. So, you know, in that space, there's lots of different ways in which government could potentially sort of catalyse sort of local ownership and local involvement. Are there any of those in particular which you're looking more actively at?
So I think, I mean, we're definitely looking at 1 and 3, so dormant assets and commissioning. And my understanding of asset-based community development is exactly what we should be doing, which is building on the strengths in communities and trusting communities to get on with it. You know, as anyone who's been close to government knows, there is a genuine tension between letting go of control and then having to explain and be accountable for where the money went. So I think that's one of the things that makes it harder for government to be active in that space, but we can get around it by working with trusted partners who help distribute money on our behalf. So I think they're all important. I think there's a huge opportunity around commissioning. There's £49 billion of government contracts, and the Social Value Act now puts a requirement in terms of procurement to consider and include social value metrics. So that is an important step forward. It's not going to change overnight. My sort of slight difference of perspective with Danny around the use of the dormant assets is actually just because I think dormant assets is some of the best grant making that we do as government. So we get a decent amount of money, we commit it really long term, and we get super expert people to deliver on and help us deliver on those issues. So I'm just sad to rock the boat on what I think is the best example of government grant making that I've seen.
Thank you. Just coming into the final several minutes, and I'd just like to go back to to the Bishop on so we're talking about this with the idea of big society and all the positive things in COVID, with lots of people getting involved in the community. Of course, some people don't have those connections, and Pippa Hockton, do you agree that we need to do more to include the marginalised in community? You know, whether it's care leavers, those leaving prison, those with no recourse to public funds, people with no connections. Is this an agenda one which is actually helping those people, or is it one which could potentially further marginalise them by assuming people have connections at a local level?
Well, I think it's why the idea of the neighbour seems to me so crucial in this, because the idea of the neighbour is deliberately non-partial. I mean, Stephen was making the point that you don't have to like your neighbour. In fact, Kierkegaard actually says, the Christian religion has never said you have to admire your neighbour; it just says you have to love them, whoever they are. And I guess the problem of the sort of tribal approach to life is that it leaves gaps of the ex-offender. And so, absolutely, I think that to rediscover an idea of love for neighbour as the sort of core obligation in our social life would begin to address that issue, because the neighbour may well be an ex-offender. What do you do there? Now that's, I think, then up to what community groups can do. So just to give you an example, one of our churches in the area where I live is very near Bronzefield Women's Prison, and they had a house which they used to use for a curate, but they don't have a curate at the moment. And so they decided, okay, we will try to use that house as a safe home for some of the women coming out of the prison. They did a deal with the prison, so the prison will pay them a certain degree of rent. They will allow that house to be used by 2 or 3 women coming out for a 6-month or a year period to enable them to transition into a more stable way of life. They're opening a cafe in the church to enable those women to get some work and enable them to kind of move on to a more stable sort of way of life as a way of reducing reoffending. Now, there's an example of one, a local community group, a church, saying, okay, what can we do to particularly address a particular social need of people who will otherwise fall between the gaps here, because otherwise these women will be leaving prison and will get into the cycle of reoffending and so on. And so I think it's that kind of deliberate action, and that's why, in some ways, there's an instinct in us always to reach out to those who are like us and who are familiar and so on. And that's why the love for neighbor is actually countercultural. It's counterintuitive. That's why it's a radical idea. It's why in the pagan world, people didn't love their neighbors. You didn't love your slaves. You didn't love people who were of a different city than you. You suspected them. This is a radical idea. And so I think love for neighbor does mean that kind of deliberate attempt to try and say, okay, I'm going to go out beyond the normal. The normal kind of connections I have to the people who otherwise would fall between the gaps, because they will be my neighbor. And institutions like churches or others saying, okay, what can we do? We can't meet every social need in our area, but what's the one thing we can do? Just like that church did with its house. That was its resource. That was something they could do, to address the need of these particular people in that area.
And Danny, those sort of people who fall between the cracks are the people who have the least connections, and actually the people who CSJ traditionally really focuses on a lot. I mean, some people are pointing out who are watching that these are people who need the statutory services, and they need government to sort of be supporting them as much as possible, presumably at the central level. I mean, not to come back, but to come back to one of the lessons from big societies, the timing of it, as you said, was unfortunately it was tainted by austerity, and there is a real risk, isn't there, that with the economic challenges to come from COVID, which I don't think most of the public have fully absorbed yet, really, beyond the public health crisis. How do we avoid this being seen as a sort of we're taking away some government services, or these are challenging economic times, so we're stripping things away, so local people have to just help themselves more.
Yeah.
How do we navigate that?
Yes, well, that is the danger, and it was part of the problem with the big society, was that we managed to get that impression. It's not, a strong society is not an alternative to a big state. I mean, the size of the state is secondary or irrelevant, really. And I'm not actually calling for a smaller state. I think what I would like is a better one, and one that does its job properly. And I think its job in the spaces we're talking about is both sort of stewarding local life. There's a democratic responsibility for national life for national government, and local life for local government. There's a role and responsibility for government to sort of convene and hold the ring for different players to operate, and then more directly to its role is in delivering acute professional services, or at least funding them and commissioning them. And if we had a well-functioning society, we would have more effective triaging, where the right support is given to people at the right moment, and we could have a far more preventative system than we do at the moment. At the moment we have, and the reason why there is so little money in the public sector is because so much money has to be spent because we spend it so late. So, in Wiltshire, we spend 60% of the council's budget on adult social care, a lot of that on very acute, expensive provision for vulnerable adults and older people, many of whom could and should have been supported more effectively and more cheaply earlier if families and communities were enabled to get around them and to support them at home. I mean, particularly for older people, rather than going to a very expensive residential care sector. So if we had communities empowered to do what communities want to do and what families want to do, I think we could radically reduce the burden of adult social care bills and enable the budget that is there to be spent much more generously on the people who need it. At the moment, we're spreading the money far too thin, so we don't give enough money to anybody, and we still don't have enough. So, a strong society enables us to use government money much better and to prioritise it. And we really need an effective partnership. And I think the narrative of either or, big state or big society, is unhelpful. We've got to have both doing their job well.
Absolutely. We've got a question about what more, how we can use local libraries better. I know that's something which you've covered in your report, Danny, so I'd encourage people to go to Danny's website and see some of his more specific recommendations in the interest of time. And Stephen, just 1 minute, just finish with you. There's got a question about how do we, what are the other methods we can use to sort of measure things, beyond money and GDP. Cameron used to talk about GWB, general well-being. Onward, the think tank, did a very good report recently trying to sort of create a social fabric index. But it's long known to be a difficult area to measure things in. CSJ's done a similar report on community capital, which highlighted the lack of data in this space. It's a hard area to measure, isn't it? I mean, with your sort of data and economic hat on, is there anything more we can be doing, maybe at government level, to provide more data?
Yeah, so just to plug once again Danny's report, which focuses quite heavily on the need for data, because it is so important. Because we focus often on local authority level, which, to paraphrase from Churchill, was like the worst for this type of stuff, the worst form of administrative unit apart from all the others. Because in a sense, it's slightly too big maybe for community, but anyway, it's the one that's best for the data that we have. But it's absolutely right. When I've started to look into this, and I'm looking into it more now, as you know, Sam, you're doing it in the future, think about what you need. What helps an individual, picture an individual to thrive. And you think, okay, well, they need jobs. Well, yes, but actually before that they need, but does that job have to be local? Therefore, what kind of community are they going to be able to kind of have the opportunity to shine from an education perspective? Are they going to get hassled on the way home? Is it going to be expected that even if they're smart, are they going to be asked, expected to go to university? So there's the norms aspect, the social, all these types of things. How much are they going to be expected? Even then, how's their well-being like? Are they going to be motivated to do well? You need to measure all of these things because, as I say, yes, if you think about it, how do you help an individual or community to thrive? Yes, you need jobs, but then beyond that, you need all of those things to happen to enable to actually fulfill that hope. And that's what we need to focus on. And that's why it's so difficult, because we need an array of data to be able to make good policy decision making. But we're getting there.
I mean, it's a huge amount here, isn't there? I will have to wrap up now. Our hour's up. Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. I tried to double barrel them as much as possible, so we got through quite a few. This conversation we'll keep having. There's a lot for a lot of people to talk about here, and it's certainly something we're going to be looking at more. So just leaves me to say thank you to all our guests on the panel. I thought it was really interesting to hear all your perspectives, and it's very kind of you to give your time. Thank you, everyone.